So yeah, talk is, what do you mean I have to secure this thing? And this is actually something that we see in our customer base all the time. And I really wanted to share kind of our experience with what we've done and also what we see for our customers. So some context setting. I'm an engineer for Alert Logic, and we are a security as a service solution provider. And really what that means is that we are ingesting petabytes of data for up to 4,000 customers. And mostly what we do is, it's sort of like a monitoring tool. We ingest this data, we look for active security attacks or signs of attacks, and then we work with our customers through a security operations center to let them know what happened, let them know how to fix something. So one of the things we've seen a lot of, especially in the past 5 years, is that as developers have moved into the cloud, they wind up getting told by someone that you have this application that you've shipped maybe outside of the normal process that the company had, especially if they had a data center, and you really need to secure it in the cloud. It might be for compliance, it might be for some other reason, but now the development team is left wondering, well, what does that even mean? Because maybe the organization didn't have a security infrastructure for the cloud. And especially with teams developing this way, they'll go off and do something new on their own and it's innovative, but they really don't think about what deployment security means. And so I really wanted to share kind of our experience with this from what we've seen and also our own experience ourselves, because we went through this about 5 years ago. We moved our backend data infrastructure from on-premise to the cloud and learned along the way. Okay, so yeah, security really does matter. I can come up with tons of examples, but I picked two that are recent. One is a U.S. transit carrier called Federal Express, and they bought a tiny little company, and all that company did was do security checks on drivers. What happened was a researcher found that they had a public Amazon S3 bucket that contained images of passports, driver's licenses, and any other security credentials for those drivers, thousands. It had been public for up to 4 years. No one knows if it was actually breached, but you can imagine if you're one of those drivers, that's not a good thing to have your passport info out there. And another big one that's really nasty was Uber. This breach actually happened in 2016, and Uber kept it quiet for over a year. They were breached by hackers. 57 million users had their email addresses, names, mobile phone numbers stolen. And then 600,000 drivers for Uber had their IDs and names stolen. And it was a ransomware thing. Uber paid it, but that information is out there. Gives you an idea that these attacks are real. And if you go back just a little further in time, a year ago, you might have heard about the U.S. company Equifax, which 150 million people had basically all their financial information stolen as far as credit worthiness and all that. All of these attacks were minor applications. They weren't even the mainstream application for these companies, and yet they had that much risk and that much exposure. And of course, Yahoo, if you go back even further in time, had billions of user accounts compromised. So when we talk about security, some very important points for the rest of this talk. So the main thing is, especially in this talk, security is mostly not about secure coding practices. Those are important, but it's not the most important thing, because chances are you'll never get it right, no matter what you do, even if you think you got it right. You have to worry about protecting your infrastructure and dealing with the fact that there will be insecure things in your code that you find out later. That is just reality. So if you want to talk about secure coding practices, I'm happy to do that offline, but most of this talk will be about deployment security, especially because as application developers, you may not be aware of the full context. The second point is I'm going to introduce a term which may be new to you. It's called security posture. And this is real important because it's a sliding scale of security. There is no such thing as perfect security or 100% security. And how far you go depends on how important your risk really is. And we'll get into that in a few slides. What you'll find is that you can't start with perfect security. You got to keep going every year and improve a little bit. And chances are the requirements would change on you anyway if you tried to do that. So, what even is deployment security? And whenever we talk about this, standards comes up immediately. And one of the most famous is payment card industry compliance, PCI compliance. This is actually how our business started years ago and how a lot of growth happened, because if you were dealing with the payment card industry and taking money, you had to follow certain rules set by them. And these were all good rules. And eventually that expands. There's now, and I think that came out in 2014, there's ISO 27001. This is a set of best practices for how you should do secure IT infrastructure, and it's going to become more and more common. It's actually a superset of PCI compliance. It's more strict. And my favorite is, we always have this ever vague security best practices that people talk about, and it doesn't mean anything. Whatever that is, you can't go and point to it and say it's exactly these things. Some things become conventional and we talk about them and we assume they're there, like say, don't store passwords ever. That's a good one. But there's really not, without a list, things that people know how to go out and do. And I've seen this over and over as you get new generations coming into the industry. It's not always obvious what they have to handle. So you really have to have something else that you're going off of and saying, we're going to take care of this problem in particular. And of course, now there's the Global Data Protection Regulation, which just went active last week. And does this really change anything for security? As far as requirements, no, not really. But what it does do is make it really crystal clear how important this is. The financial risk to companies if they do this wrong is now monumental. It's not just embarrassing. So what this is really doing with our customers and ourselves is it's making us look at, what is the personally identifying information that we need to worry about? And are we doing the right thing there? So cautionary note, some vendors will try to use scare tactics to give you a solution that's more complicated than you really need. This doesn't always help security. Doing more can sometimes be worse. And one of my favorite examples of that, it's possible to encrypt data such that it actually makes you less secure. And that's a long, complicated discussion, but if you can imagine, if you encrypt stuff so that hackers can hide, and that happens a lot, then that's not actually really good. So watch out for mostly consultants on this. Vendors generally don't do this. I've seen some exceptions in encryption vendors. All right, so the very first thing you want to do when you are thinking about your application is you want to do a risk assessment for even what kind of risk you are. And I will summarize this table. High risk is this if you have consumer or end customer information, especially any personally identifying information that includes employees, or if it impacts your business operations immediately, that's a high risk system, and you just go there right away. Most of our end products are those. Moderate risk still has a high level of security, but those are mostly internal tools. You may not have personally identifying information, but it can impact business operations, especially internal operations. So that's more of a medium risk. And then low risk is when you don't have any of those things. Okay. The one note that people miss often in some of these risk assessments, though, is if these lower medium systems have access to the high critical systems, usually indirectly, or if it's actually directly, like say publishing code to production, that's a good example, that then means that that system needs higher risk. Okay, so that's important to remember for the rest of that. So what I want to do now then is give you a quick overview of some of the main types of tools that you have to worry about. And if you're not a security professional, you probably don't care about most of these. But if you're doing this yourself or having to worry about it, it's good to know what they are. And then that will tie back into which tools you need for which risk. So my favorite one is actually configuration and vulnerability scanning. Pretty much you should be using this on every environment, especially if you're a development team. This really became more powerful in the cloud because we were able to look at the cloud APIs and figure out exactly what your configuration is. It's not a guess. It's not something that someone has to type in. We know precisely what servers you have, etc. So those can actually look at that configuration and see if you're doing anything wrong. For example, you have a public S3 bucket. That's a good example of that. Vulnerability scanning is real important. That's actually, usually it's either a network scan or even a software image scan. Those are super important to do, and they're usually mandatory for any of the compliance stuff. But you can imagine, say you're building a Docker container, or even you're building stuff out of GitHub. You don't actually know everything that's in your chain of code. You have an idea, but you don't actually know. And you may not know that this third stream component that you're depending on has a vulnerable version of SSL or TLS. And so vulnerability scanners will help you find that And it's really about the only way to keep track of what's going on. Log management is another one that's super important. You should have this anyway. It makes distributed system debugging super important. But these, the whole intent of log management is to collect all of your system and application logs and store it so you can search it. But it enables you to do not only debugging, but diagnosis if you do get breached, especially because you usually don't find out about breaches until later. And so you'll often have to go back in time and find the root cause. An intrusion detection system is probably one that you haven't heard of if you're not a security professional. These are actively watching your network. Back in the physical data center, we would plug them into the network backbone. In the cloud, it has to work a little differently. But they're looking for signatures of bad traffic. And usually it's written by security professionals that say, okay, I know this attack will look like this. And if that message is seen on the network, it sends it back to our data center and we let the customer know after some analysis. These are very important for high or critical risk environments. I'll mention firewalls briefly. Right? We all know about network firewalls. We may not know about web application firewalls. This is really useful for a high risk application that's a web app. And generally what those do is they keep bad traffic out of a web application that doesn't make sense for it. And a good example is this field should only take numbers, and it's only 10 digits, so I don't need to paste a 400 kilobyte image into it. And the WAF will keep that from even showing up to the web server. And it learns from your normal traffic. That's what's interesting about them. Okay. File integrity monitoring is an interesting tool. It's not as useful, in my opinion, in the cloud as it is on premises. But what these do is they look for changes to system files that don't make sense. One of my favorite examples of this, because a lot of people have seen that, is if you run WordPress, there's actually a plugin, a security plugin, that will look for changes to the .htaccess file, which is one of the most common ways attackers get into your system. If that file changes, something's wrong, right? So that plugin tells you that. That's what a FIM does. And then I'll mention this so you're aware of it. Endpoint management is a huge deal in the cybersecurity business, and really more for IT departments, not for people running software applications. But it's important to know about. If you have a high-risk environment, you have to make sure that the people connecting to the environment are on authorized systems. And usually this is making sure your virus scanner is up to date and that you're actually authorized. And different departments in different size companies do this differently. I won't talk about that again, but just know it's part of the authentication to allowing you to get access to a critical system. Okay, so you take all that information and you overlay that on your risk assessment, and sorry, it's a little low for those in the back. The general idea is that if you're a high-risk classification, then you're going to need to use a lot of those tools, if not all of them, to really meet the security posture that you need. Scanning, log monitoring, and IDS without question, and firewalls without question too. A WAF may or may not make sense for you depending on your application. But for moderate and low, you can start to drop different requirements because they're not actually necessary for the security posture that you need. For example, if you're a moderate system, and imagine an internal development tool that's critical, but it's not going to cause an embarrassing thing. And if it gets breached, you probably don't need active monitoring as much as configuration monitoring. Okay. And that's useful because that keeps you from spending money on security tools or even time that you don't need to worry about. Okay, so let's say you've actually shipped an app. What can I do right now if I'm being told I have to secure this? So I'll give you some actions you can take. So one is this is a non-obvious one, even though it should be, is as you go through this, document it. This is actually a requirement if you ever get audited by, say, the PCI auditors. They'll want to know about what your policies are. And it's actually real important for you because if you actually get breached, what you don't want to do is have to figure out what to do on the fly in a stressful situation. So you document this, and it's kind of a policy to what you've done and how you should work. And it just helps you figure out what's going on, right? If you're in systems administration, this is a normal thing, but if you're a developer, this may not be. And of course, you want to protect your deployment. This is probably something we all know we should do, and it's interesting that often developers don't because they have a different use case. Using a network firewall properly, use a WAF properly. I'll give you an example in a few slides about how we had a customer that had Kubernetes ports wide open to the internet because they just didn't think that it was important. And it turned out that that endpoint was not protected from authentication issues. So it's very important. Keep people out of your network that don't belong, otherwise it's easy for them. Okay. Related, secure access controls should be mandatory. Now this is also mostly a system administration thing, but it's important if you are a DevOps team and maintaining your own production environment. You don't want people to be able to connect to production that shouldn't be there. Strong passwords, two-factor authentication, really without question. We are starting to move to where we use two-factor authentication everywhere, even in our low environments, because social engineering works, and this just helps that go away. One thing, if you are, this is a plea for anyone that might be involved with password policies, don't mess that up. And what I mean by that, you may have all had this experience. If you use a password manager and you go to someone's site that won't let you use the password manager, that does not help security. You know, if I can't paste in my giant random password, that didn't actually help anybody. In fact, that means I have to go use a password that's less secure. I think most people are getting that message, but occasionally I'll still see a brand new website or internal system that doesn't let that work. Systems management best practices should be a tricky one. Is another best practice problem. Like, what does that really mean? But I listed these three because it's remarkable how often we see customers that don't do these three things. And these are not small customers. These are in big professional companies. Keeping your software systems up to date, right? That sounds obvious, but if you think about the DevOps world, now you have developers worried about that when it used to be someone else's problem. And imagine the world of where you're building container images all the time. Now you are on the hook for making sure your systems are patched regularly. One of the things that's really neat about best practice now as far as cloud deployments is that we no longer, I mean, not everybody does this yet, but mostly people don't treat servers as special anymore. And that's important because you can destroy them all the time and rebuild them with new images kind of on the fly. If you haven't done that, it's harder to patch things, right? But going into a world of where servers aren't special and you can replace them means you can do patches all day long and never be behind on that. That's important. The Equifax breach, for example, happened because of one vulnerability in Apache struts that they forgot to patch. It happened for a lot of other reasons, but that was the one they blamed it on. Back up your data. Again, it's amazing how often people don't do that. And usually when a ransomware attack happens, it only matters if you haven't backed up your data. So the other that may not be as obvious, but I found it to be super critical, is you want to, in the last bullet down there, is metric and log storage and auditing should be something you always do. If you're not keeping metrics along with your logs, especially for more than a week, then it's really hard to do postmortems, excuse me. And so do that as long as you can afford to. You know, we do it for 90 days in our organization. It's often not enough. Least privilege access is a real important point, and it's different from how people used to code in on-premise deployments. So cloud APIs make this much easier and more powerful than before. So what I mean by that is if you have an application, you don't want to give it root level privileges if you can avoid it. And really there's no reason to. Even if it needs system priv, you can actually do that in probably a very small piece of code. In the cloud, as an example, I don't need to give an application complete control over Amazon S3 or DynamoDB. I can just say I need to use this table, and I need to use it from a write and read fashion, but that's it. You pick what actually matters for that application, rather than just being kind of lazy and saying, well, everything, you know, star permission. What that does is not only is it better for the application, it actually prevents the application from being misused should a breach ever occur. It's very hard to work around those sorts of secure access limits if they're in place. What's nice about it then is if you take a configuration management tool, that's one of the things they'll look for. And it's really gratifying to be able to have that tool tell you, you've got this database here, and the only people and only software that can access that is this application, this role, and then these system administrators. And they can only do backups. Everything else is off limits, like no exception. So if someone gets into the system, they still can't see it. Data encryption is a fun topic because it's easily misused. There's two things I'll talk about in particular, but we could probably spend days talking about this one. One is you absolutely do want to do encryption in transit from insecure networks to secure networks. You don't really have to worry about it much in a secure network, especially in the cloud. We often see customers that wind up doing multiple levels of encryption in transit, and it actually doesn't help them. It makes things worse. The thing, though, is You need to make sure developers understand this and actually understand the technology. It's surprising how often we run into, I would say the vast majority of times, developers don't understand the difference between SSL and TLS, and they don't understand which ciphers they should use and shouldn't use. And you don't have to be a cryptologist to care. You just need to know enough to understand that that one is not something you should ship. It's usually something more of, I want SSL, and that's all they care about. Encryption at rest is a big topic, especially with personally identifying information and payment card industry stuff. The idea is that if it's critical information that you don't want someone to have access to, even if they breach you, you encrypt it in a database or in a file system behind the scenes. It's not something the application actively has to do. And that's useful because you can come in later and add it without having to rewrite the application. Use this, but be careful about it. You don't have to encrypt everything, and a lot of encryption vendors will try and get you to do that. But it's actually a waste and often doesn't help your security posture. And to give you an example, we encrypt all of the raw data we get from our customers, every single bit of it. But we also build a lot of metadata out of that data. And let's say it contains customers' names or IP addresses for their internal networks, almost all of which are 192.168 something, right? Is that worth encrypting or not? And we have that debate quite a bit. And the tools haven't really allowed it. So what we do with encryption at rest when we talk to customers about it is we ask them to think about what would happen if you were breached. What are you actually protecting against? And usually you have two answers. One is, I don't want someone to steal the hard drives from my data center. And if you think about a cloud, that basically can't happen, or at least there's some trust level that they're physically destroying the hard drives. But it's so distributed, there's probably no such thing as your hard drive, right? But what about someone breaching your network and then trying to copy a database snapshot? Absolutely, you want to encrypt that, and that's something that these tools can make automatic. Configuration and vulnerability scanning tools. I think everybody should use these, and what's nice is that basic versions are usually built into clouds now. Amazon in particular has a few, and these are super useful. Crucial for all risk profiles. They can actually tell you things that it's not obvious. Like, oh, I left that cipher turned on. I didn't even realize I did that. Or I left the network port turned on. The nice thing about the march towards containers is that we're all getting a little bit more judicious about making containers smaller and the footprint of software installed smaller. And so there's less risk. But now we're using more images from upstream that are binaries. And so now there's more uncontrolled risk of things you don't know about. So that can really help. Most attacks occur because of this, okay? I can't stress that enough. Most attacks occur because someone didn't turn something off that they could have and was already known. This is a fun slide. I will summarize. Top 10 AWS configuration errors and top 10 scanning vulnerabilities that we find across our fleet of customers. Over and over and over, it's almost all these 10. So in the configuration errors, mostly what you're looking at here are things like they didn't encrypt an EBS volume or an AMI, or they didn't have a user set up with two-factor authentication. It's that sort of thing. There's a risk vector now open because something wasn't configured. User access key not configured for a rotation. That's not going to breach you, but it makes it a lot easier that someone can steal something that's old and get in, right? So those are important little things. When you have policies attached directly to the user, as an example, down here on the bottom, you're not using security roles properly, and it's really easy to get that wrong. So those are the sorts of things we see out of config errors. Now, the scanning vulnerabilities are fun because I think 8 out of the 10 here are related to TLS, SSL, and ciphers. So that gives back to the point of make sure people understand that, because we don't, as a rule. Other than that, they're like usually old password encryption algorithms or things like that that are being misused. That's typically what we see over and over and over. So without these tools, customers are actually shipping things, like most of us are shipping things to production that are vulnerable, and like not abstractly vulnerable, but actually vulnerable. So that's the sort of things you'll typically run into. And of course, if you're development, you should do code audits and look for a couple things in particular. So one is going back to the idea of permissions that things don't need. Look for if your application is requiring root access or if it's requiring full access to a database. Chances are it doesn't need to, right? And that's real important. Now, it's tricky for developers because in dev mode, they want to just have access to things. And what we've done over time is we've actually made our development environment mimic production so closely that we avoid that. It's still a few surprises when we go to production, like, oh, someone had that privilege wide open, but in general, it just makes life easier, and it doesn't really slow you down. Because there's a difference between I'm running on my laptop and actually doing the initial development to running in a secure context is actually what the application's all about. Top one. I shouldn't have to say this, but apparently we do because it's about 80% of our customers do this. Credentials for production stored in code repositories all the time. That's how that Uber attack happened, by the way, right? Someone social engineered their internal GitHub and stole production Amazon credentials out of a source code. And yeah, you will, yeah. And so the comment was, if you search on GitHub for certificates or passwords, you'll find a bunch. I've been guilty of this myself. It's easy, especially if you think the system you're protecting is just not that important, or if it's internal. And that's always a surprise when it winds up being breached. As an example, it's really fun these days to actually breach someone's build system and inject bad code into their build system. We find a lot of that, and we find crypto miner malware being installed that way, especially. People just never know it's there. So the problem with that one is that it's challenging to actually do that correctly. Amazon is making that easier, and so is Azure, with key management systems built into their infrastructure, so you don't have to worry about the hardest problem. But this is an ongoing thing, and expect it to get easier. And right now, it's actually a little bit of work. It's work for us in our system to actually say, these credentials that exist in production, the developers never see, the sysadmins never see, but the code can somehow get them in a way that's secure. A couple of quick topic points on containers that are special. So the IDS systems, intrusion detection, they look at network traffic. And so they're looking at traffic from host to host. And previously, containers there might be thousands of them on a host. Which container is it that has bad traffic going to it? You didn't really know. So tools were a little limited on that. That's changing now. And in fact, our company just released last week a version of our IDS that supports containers specifically. And what's cool about that is we actually, in beta, we found a breach that I'll tell you about that was actually really fun. So if you want to read more about it, actually on our company's blog, they have this is what our security analysts do, is they do a post-mortem on every attack that's interesting, and they publish the details of what they found. And so it's a really neat view of how a security professional thinks about finding things. But what happened was we found a crypto miner application installing itself on the customer's containers. And how that happened was the Kubernetes control plane API is unauthenticated by design. And they had those ports open on the internet. It's very common. If you go and actually do a network scan, you'll find this all over the place. They secured the network, and then they installed our tool because we were coming out with the beta. And then the tool noticed it right away for 2 new containers, but it actually had been 2 old containers that were breached months before that with the malware, and the malware just kept spreading itself. So we had to actually use our logging system to go find out, how did that actually happen back in time? If they weren't monitoring the CPU closely, they really wouldn't have noticed because it didn't impact their application. But it's obviously not good. This is really common in Amazon because people want to use the cloud resources a lot. So you have to watch that. Question that comes up a lot with our customers: are container platforms less secure? And I would say the answer is no, but they are new. So there's going to be a lot of new attack vectors that people go and exploit that we don't even think about now. And certainly taking binaries from other people is a good example of that. I mean, that's going to be problematic for a while until we narrow that down. I saw a good blog entry that was related to that recently. If you're like, say, a Node.js user or something like that, or even hex.pm for Erlang and Elixir, can you really trust everything upstream that hasn't been compromised? We have that trust built in that if something is compromised, we'll find out about it quickly, but there is a trust factor there. And usually that does happen quickly, but sometimes attackers are smart and they'll leave something in wait for years before they activate it. That is especially true for the actors that work for governments. They're very patient compared to people just trying to make a few bucks. Okay. So that's it. What I wanted to do was give you an idea of kind of what we see from our customers and give you an idea of just really the space involved in protecting your environment. And if you have any questions, now's a good time. There's one back there.